Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Europe Talk Solidarity Conference. It is our third and final day of the conference, and we have the honor of having two wonderful guests with us today to have a look in the future. We've had a wonderful conference so far, so we have had interesting talks here in Helsinki, and hopefully all the online viewers have had a good time as well. So welcome to all of you here sitting in Helsinki, or those of you following somewhere else, wherever you may be. So we'll start the session with looking at solidarity from the future perspective. And the first keynote to join us will be Mr. Tommi Laitio, who currently works as the inaugural fellow at the Bloomberg Center for Public Innovation at Johns Hopkins University in the United States. He'll be joining us online. Tommi also used to work as the director of the City of Helsinki Department for Youth Work and Culture, and you might notice that there are some wonderful thoughts by Tommi in this notebook that the participants here in Helsinki received. So you may have seen his name here. But without, again, further ado, please, Tommi, welcome to Helsinki.
Thank you so much, Annina, and good morning, everyone. I wish I could be there with you, but I had earlier promised to be here in Oslo for another European gathering that's around public libraries. So good cause here as well. But I'm lucky to have the opportunity to join you through this connection. I'll share the presentation. This is the most exciting and nerve-wracking part of the presentation. If this goes well, then everything goes well after that. Good morning. So I will be talking today about, especially I'm working on cities and talking about kind of what are the conditions for solidarity that we need, what are people going through in cities, and kind of what would be the building blocks for solidarity in the future and actually in the near future. I'll say a few words about my background and kind of how I come into this issue before jumping into this content. As Annina mentioned, I've worked for the last decade or so for the City of Helsinki, first working as the Director of Youth Affairs, so running youth clubs, supporting youth organizations, supporting young people at risk, and having the overall responsibility in the city for providing hobbies for young people, and then also young people's civic engagement. And for the last 5 years, I was in charge of this bigger division in Helsinki, which is called Culture and Leisure. And all of those services, culture, sports, libraries, and youth, are things that bring meaning to people's lives. But I think, especially in this gathering, it's worth noting that my own journey into looking at young people's lives and improving young people's lives in a city comes from a volunteering sector. I started doing things with other people in the Scouts when I was 10, and then did a lot of things in the Scouting movement, understood that volunteering is probably the best background you can have for a public sector leader, because you really focused on motivating people rather than telling people what to do. Because I think really meaningful things happen when people think that people have a sense that they have agency in their own lives. As Annina mentioned, I'm now for 2 years in Baltimore in the United States at Johns Hopkins University, which is one of the best universities in America, on this fellowship, which is basically 2 years to think about the future of public services, the future of cities, basically. And my work focuses especially on parks, libraries, as these public spaces that create meaning for people in our lives. I work for this center called Bloomberg Center for Public Innovation, where we basically look at how civic engagement can be done in cities, how we can improve public services, and especially do it in a way that builds trust in public service, but also trust towards other people. We work across the world. This is some of the cities where we're working at the moment. supporting civil society organizations, supporting city governments on making cities work better for the people who are in them and giving people in those cities more power to influence their future and present. We have the strongest presence in the United States, but work more and more with cities in Latin America and also here in Europe, I can say. So that's kind of the background. But going into the subject, I believe very much in this thought that comes from an American community organizer, Saul Alinsky, who played an instrumental role in Chicago in pushing for affordable housing for people. And Saul Alinsky writes in his amazing book, small book, it's called Rules for Radicals. And he writes, as an organizer, I start from where the world is as it is, not as I would like it to be. It is necessary to begin where the world is if we are going to change it to what we think it should be. That means working in the system. And what he means with this is that if you want to build an emotional connection to people, if you want to build something together with other people, you have to start from the world where people are. You have to recognize the pains, but also the possibilities that are in that world. It doesn't mean that you don't have ambition, but if you start directly from where you would want the world to be, as he writes, you generally kind of cause confusion. And I think it's important to recognize where we are and what's the kind of the landscape that where, for instance, young people are growing up at the moment. The more and more young people nowadays live in cities, and my work has focused very much on the kind of urban experience. And I moved to the US in January and have really focused on trying to make sense of what are the dynamics that are in play when we think about young people living in cities and actually the conditions for solidarity. And this is the best image that I've been able to produce. It's by intention messy. I've been reading a lot of sociology over the last couple of months, and it kind of resonates also with my own experience, both living in a city and working in a city, now moving to a city where actually I didn't know anyone before I moved. I've been looking at this German sociologist, Georg Simmel, from the 1800s, so this is old stuff, where he writes about cities being in these places where we can focus on doing things than other people. Cities are concentrations of very different people. And why miracles happen in cities, arts, different innovations, companies flourishing, and good lives happen is because of the potential that you have in cities. The fact that we don't have to do everything that we need in our lives. We can focus on being, for instance, a librarian or a youth worker, because we know that someone else takes care of the store that we need for our groceries. So while we move to cities because of this freedom that they provide, but we are also at the same time more and more dependent on other people helping us with our daily needs or the things that bring value into our lives. And what Georg Simmel writes about is that at the same time when we are able to specialize in some things like studying in a city, and we are more dependent on other people, it's close to impossible, and I would even say it is impossible for us to really make sense of how other people impact our lives and how we impact other people. And it's very, for our brain and for our sense of self, as in who we are, it's quite tough when we are not able to make sense of how all these lines go and what are the strong lines that push us into a certain direction, when us not doing something actually makes life difficult for someone else. And it's kind of, it gets very easily messy. And if we put on top of this the things we see in the news and the things we know through education, we look at the situation through young people's experience, you put the diversity struggles, you put climate change on top of this, the current war in Ukraine, it gets quite taxing for people to try to make sense of who I am and what I can do. American novelist Jenny Offel writes really beautifully in her fairly recent book, about this sense when kind of big and small things start getting into this blurry mess inside our heads. And she writes through this fictional person, Lizzie, who's a librarian, about this observation that she sees in her own life, but also in her work in a library. She writes, young person worry, what if nothing I do matters? What if world is kind of beyond repair? And then old person worry, what if everything I do does? And both of these are actually easily quite paralyzing. They might easily make us stop in our feet because things seem too difficult for us to carry, or it might feel that it's too late to fix. You're already kind of caused such a mess that kind of it's beyond repair. And I think this is what a lot of people are going through in our cities. And there's two very typical psychological reactions to this sense of overload, the sense of losing your sense of self, losing the sense of control. One of them is that we refrain, we leave public life. We're like, it's too much to handle. I'm just going to focus on my family, my friends, my work, my studies. I'm not going to care about other people. I'm going to focus on getting the right sofa. I'm going to get the right pillows. I'm going to take care of my kids. In a way, seeing life as this like battle for other people and like creating these like small universes for us inside cities to have a sense of control and keeping a sense of self. The other psychological strategy, and we have more tools for this than ever, is that we start shouting louder. We see life as a battle with other people, and we just shout louder because we think that if we're not shouting louder, someone else is shouting louder, and they take all the room. And actually, both of these create this condition that we are constantly fighting for attention and resources with other people. They both lead us hoarding resources to ourselves, like making the toilet paper phenomenon that we saw during COVID. I'm just going to make sure that I don't need anyone to meet my basic needs, or I need to claim more room for myself, because if I don't do that, other people do. And I think both of these are really tough things from a solidarity point of view to fight on. We have so many incentives, so many things that push us into either taking distance to other people, closing ourselves from other people, or shouting over other people in today's world. So what should we focus on? What are I don't think there's one quick fix, but if we try to kind of search ways that we get to a world of greater solidarity, I think there's two issues that are really significant. One of them is the sense of recognition and respect, feeling like you're seen as a full person with rights and also the right to determine who you are and what's that story where you are the main character. And then the other thing is joint action. I genuinely believe, and there's tons of research to back this up, that actually when the world seems hopeless, action, even I would say any action, creates hope, especially when it's with other people. So feeling recognized as a full person, and then joint action. And I'll go slightly deeper into these for a moment. On recognition and respect, the clear thing that needs to happen, and I think where we have a big void in our society at the moment, and why we react to other people in such a hostile manner, is that we feel like someone else is defining our story, and we feel that we are seen as an anybody or nobody rather as a somebody. And I think every person should have the right to be treated as a somebody. That's why being here, for instance, in Oslo for a library conference is so wonderful, because Oslo just built a wonderful new main library where people genuinely have the right to lead their own story. And that's not selfish. I think we all need a sense of self to be able to open to other people. I think there's three things that are really important for this recognition and respect. The first thing is that we need other people and the society to recognize that they're suffering. I think, for instance, arts in public space can play a huge role in driving our moral to a better place, to making us feel like we're not alone with this. And I think we shouldn't shy away from dealing with issues like fear as a public issue. The other issue is that I think recognition and respect is very much about feeling welcome to take part in things, even as an audience. The idea that you as a person should have the right, not just the opportunity, but the right to experience a lot of things and experience life in its full potential. And then the third one that, for instance, links to the work that's done in libraries in all parts of the world is this idea that you have the right to share space with other people. You're not pushed out. You're allowed to, even if you don't interact with other people, but you have the right to share space with other people and define actually what you do in that space. And I think these are all needed for that sense of feeling like I'm seen as a somebody, or somebody would notice if I'm not here. And then the other part is joint action. And I think that's, for instance, that's the importance of gatherings like the one that we are in now. I think we should, and I think Europe is fairly far in this, but we should still invest more in it, that more and more people should have the possibility to experience joint action across national borders. I think the last months have shown why we need solidarity, why Europe needs to stick together, not in a closed border way, but in a way that we make our values visible. And I think all of us in this gathering know also from a personal level what it does to us when we encounter people from different countries and different cultures. It actually brings clarity to our personal story, but also helps us understand how the conditions we grew up in are different than those of other people. The second part of joint action, and I think there's really a need to invest in our societies in this, is collaborative action across generations. So this sense of like we're not fighting with each other over this. We might disagree, but we should build this collaboration around respect. Going back to that idea of what if nothing I do matters, or what if everything I do does. But understanding also that there's tons of different generational experience, and it's not a question of who's right. It's about building coalitions where we don't have to agree on everything, but we can still move the society forward. And then joint action is doing it in public space, having an impactful impact on the public space, seeing that you are able to have an influence, a physical, real influence in your daily surroundings. And I genuinely believe that, for instance, this is the potential of cities. Cities, unlike nation states, are places where, if we want to do that, people have the right to feel like they are from Amsterdam or Belgrade from day one, whereas national identity is much more tricky. And I think that's why, for instance, having a visible impact in your own city is a really important way of building that sense of citizenship. When we think about solidarity, I think it calls for courage, but I think courage is usually built through connections to other people. And I think in order to build stronger societies where we don't close off from other people, we need two kinds of ties to build a sense of solidarity and actually skills to solidarity. The one part is going back to that, seen as a somebody, is that we need, for feeling like we have a sense of self and a sense of home, we need some strong ties. These are family, these are lifelong friendships, people who carry us even if terrible, unfortunate things happen. I think in order to open up to other people, it's really important to have that security net in a way. People who don't define us based on what we do, but who we are, and they love us as who we are. But we also need a lot of these weak ties, like acquaintances, colleagues, people who belong to the same NGO with us. Because I think trust, courage, and the audacity or courage to act is built from seeing that I'm not alone with this. There's a lot of people who would want the world to work differently, and building that critical mass. And I think cities can support both of these, that we are able to live out these strong ties in our parks and libraries and cultural events. And then that when we move in public space, we don't feel like we are constantly in competition with other people, but we can actually feel like they are on our side, even if we don't know them all by name. But I think we have more abilities to act publicly if we feel like the other people in the public space don't create a threat to us. And I think there's a lot of things in our societies nowadays that push us to see other people in public space as either as a threat or fearful thing for us, and really going into that space of like seeing other people through the hope and potential that they entail. I want to close off by going back to the basics. Aristotle in ancient Greece wrote about good life, a meaningful life, and I think also changing our goal from happiness to a good life also brings better conditions for solidarity. I think all of us in this room, my guess is that a lot of you have been doing things with other people, but we also should recognize that it's kind of a privilege to be able to live that life where you are able to feel valuable to a community. And I think we really need to invest in making sure that as many people as possible don't have obstacles to join other people, even slowly and even in a smaller scale. And at the same time, making sure that when new people join our activities or just like show that tiny glimpse of hope that things could be different, that we are able to welcome them in. Because as Aristotle writes, a good life is being able to use one's skills for the benefit of one's community. And that means that you have to have skills, you have to be recognized as skillful, as a somebody, and you have to have a community that accepts you as a member of that community. Thank you so much.
Tommi, thank you very much. And we will have a joint questions and answer session with Tommi and our next guest speaker. So please jot down all your questions, both online and here in the plenary. So I'm sure that we will have a wonderful joint discussion after these two keynotes. But after Tommi, we will have a look at the future of solidarity in the EU. And for that, we have Sophie Pornschlegel, who is the Senior Policy Analyst at the European Policy Centre. So please welcome Sophie.
Thank you for the presentation. Yeah, sorry, before I mix up everything.
Yes, sorry.
No worries.
Here it is. Here we go.
Thanks. Right, so I was told to use the double mic, so I can't move. I'm sorry about that. But I'm super happy to be here and to have a presentation in person. I think we've all been in front of Zoom screens far too much, and I'm still slowly going back into, having presentations that are in people. I live in Brussels and I work as a senior policy analyst in the European Policy Centre, which is a Brussels-based think tank where we really focus on EU nerdy stuff, which is very policy-based. I was very impressed by the presentation of Tommi Laitio, especially its corporate design. I think we have some work to do there, but that's the problem with academics and think tankers. And my presentation will be more focused on the policy aspects of the European Union policies. Last year, I did a fellowship with the Charlemagne Prize, which is a relatively big prize award for European integration, where I was researching EU solidarity, especially in the COVID-19 crisis. The topic was really, really big, and suddenly everyone started talking about solidarity and what it means. And so I kind of looked into it, what it means at EU level as well, and whether there is more to solidarity. And before I continue talking, I have to remember that I do have a presentation. And I think that all of us know that solidarity is something that we talk a lot about. As I mentioned, the COVID-19 crisis, in the migration crisis, there was a huge, call for action for solidarity. And even now with Ukraine as well, we say that we need to be in solidarity with Ukrainians who have to face Russian aggression. But the question is, what does it mean more than a call to action? And I think that is the real problem. I put here a quote of the Spanish Prime Minister during the COVID-19 crisis. I know everyone wants to forget about the COVID-19 crisis, but yeah, it was still there not too long ago. And he said that without solidarity, there can be no cohesion. Without cohesion, there will be disaffection, and the credibility of the European project will be severely damaged. And I think it really shows well that solidarity is more than just a call to action. It really is the foundation as well for cohesion within the European project. And I put a wonderful picture of, video conferences that we had to face with all the EU leaders there. Where, by the way, it was very difficult for them to find negotiating tactics because they were all in front of screens, showing also how important it is to actually meet in person to experience solidarity. So this is the COVID-19 crisis, but solidarity is nothing new in the EU. I had to put in a quote of Robert Schuman, who in the Schuman Declaration in 1950, which really was the basis for solidarity, of European integration, already talked about solidarity quite a lot. And he said Europe will not be made all at once or according to a single plan. It will be built through concrete achievements which first create de facto solidarity. And I think that's a really interesting quote, and you've probably heard it several times before, but it is a really interesting quote because it explains that solidarity can be built through politics. And it's something that, politicians also have something to do with. And when I delved into, the topic of solidarity, I realized that solidarity is very much based on the nation state, which makes it very hard to create at EU level. Because if you think of welfare systems, for instance, it's mostly based on national identity and solidarity that you have with your peer fellows that are from the same national identity. And that's why EU solidarity, I think, is such an interesting movable feast, because it is created through politics as well. And that ties can change and don't necessarily have to stay at national level. So this is the nerdy part. I apologize in advance, but I think it's quite interesting because I looked into the different ways solidarity exists at EU level. And what was maybe a positive thing to realize is that there is a strong basis in the EU treaties for solidarity. I won't go through all the articles, but as you know, solidarity is mentioned as a value in Article 2 and Article 3. It is mentioned as a principle of solidarity and fair sharing of responsibility. And I think there the connection between solidarity and responsibility is quite interesting, so that solidarity doesn't come, for free, but also that you are responsible for your fellow peers. And finally, it's also as a clause. And that's an interesting one because it's solidarity, for instance, in case of disasters or in case of natural catastrophes, where basically member states say, okay, if, you have forests burning in Greece, then we all have to kind of be in solidarity with them and help them also with money. And I think that's also an interesting aspect, that solidarity also has to do with less fun parts like money. And that's especially the case at EU level. So that's the good part. There is a strong basis for solidarity in the treaties, but the big problem in the EU is that solidarity is not well detailed. So we don't really know what it means when it's a clause, a principle, and a value. There is a strong legal basis, but we haven't done much with it for now. If you look at it, what is institutionalized at EU level is that, as I mentioned, you have, for instance, a solidarity clause in case of natural disasters, in case of terrorist attacks, which was the case in France, for instance. You also have an aspect which is closer to what we see at nation-state level, which is cohesion policy, for instance, where you have transfers of money between regions that are structurally weaker, for instance, or even in between countries. I mean, the Next Generation EU Fund could also be seen as something of solidarity where not everyone was equally affected. I mean, we were all affected by COVID, but some had better starting conditions, to deal with such a pandemic, and others didn't. And having a common fund basically means that you support those who had the least good starting conditions. And last but not least, also the social policies, which the EU doesn't have a lot of competences in, unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, depending on the positions you have. But that's also, I would say, part of solidarity mechanisms that you can see, for instance, the European Pillar of Social Rights, that still needs to be implemented. So that's on the institutionalized part, and then you have ad hoc solidarity in crisis moments. And I think that in the last years, you saw that quite a lot. You saw it during the Euro crisis. There again, it depends on the perspectives you have, depending on the member states, what kind of solidarity there was. I think Greek and Germans will have very different perspectives on what solidarity means. And I think that's why it's also so important to meet here and to discuss what solidarity actually means at European level together, because our perspectives on solidarity are extremely different, depending on, our national background, obviously the age and all these identity markers. That in brackets, I mentioned the Euro crisis, the migration crisis. We saw solidarity, maybe not enough solidarity with migrants, so it was really directed at another group, an external group, I would even say, than those living in Europe. In Brexit, I think it's an interesting case for solidarity where lots of people said that, seeing a country leave, there was a strong unity amongst the others for realizing that, we're better off together. And I think that could also be seen as some kind of common solidarity against the UK in that case. And last but not least, COVID, but I won't get into too many details because we've seen that. This is like the more nerdy slides, so I will not get over it. But I think the most important one is that I try to look at, the policy dimensions of it. And unfortunately, one of the big conclusions I had from my research last year is that you do have national solidarity that remains first order. It's the kind of solidarity that is the strongest one, that is the most institutionalized one, where you not only have civil society solidarity, but also, political solidarity with the welfare state, with pension systems, with taxes, which is a solidarity mechanism, because us all agreeing to pay income tax, to have, a health system, pensions, and common schools in the end means that we're in solidarity with our common peers, and that you also have common rights to vote together. So really the political system and solidarity are closely linked together. And we don't yet have this at EU level because the EU, as you know, is not a fully formed political system. Well, it is a political system, but it doesn't have the same quality as the nation state. And that's why EU solidarity still is second order. And I tried to look at the kind of dimensions you have. And interestingly, you have a lot of interstate solidarity. So Next Generation EU package in COVID-19 is typical interstate solidarity, where one member state will say, yes, we're okay to give money to another member states because we all agreed 27 together. So that's quite developed. You also have interterritorial, which is like cohesion funds. So, one region getting money, and another region getting money. And the last one is interpersonal solidarity, and that's the one that is the least developed at EU level, which means that in between citizens, there's not much there yet. You do have funds such as the European Solidarity Corps, of course, but they're comparatively little money when you look at Next Generation EU. I won't go too much into details, just here on that slide, what is interesting is that looking at the current policy fields the EU is working on, especially the Green Deal and the digital field, is that we see that there's a movement where you cannot get rid of solidarity mechanisms, because if you think of the Green Deal, there will be social consequences of, reaching climate neutrality. And that's why you need stuff like the Just Transition Fund, where we will help those who have, the least good starting conditions to deal with climate change. And that's why the EU will have to get more competences in the field of solidarity, and that we will have to develop solidarity mechanisms to make sure that we actually reach the challenges that we have together. And that is a crucial point in a way, because that means that European integration is not something that we should just talk about, but it's necessary for us moving forward. A lot of details, a lot of EU stuff, a lot of fun, so you don't have to have a look at all of this. What is interesting in the Green Deal case is that it's very sensitive as a subject. And those are the kind of discussions that you have in Brussels a lot. For now, what we see is that you have a lot of interstate compensation mechanisms. You know, as I mentioned with the Next Generation EU Fund, it's a bit the same. It's like, you know, the council with the 27 heads of states and governments who will say, okay, Poland is very reliant on coal, so we need to give them more money so that they can, you know, build more renewables, for instance. That's the interstate compensation mechanisms you have at the moment. And that creates problems, because it can create the problem that, for instance, as I mentioned here, and I know it's very provocative, that Dutch citizens will not be happy with it, that their government will give money to the Polish government for Polish middle-class citizens to then build more energy-efficient buildings, because they don't have that sense of solidarity amongst each other yet, and that it goes through their government, and then they see it's their money being taken away and given to someone else in the EU. And that's quite problematic. And that's why we need, in my view, to develop more interpersonal solidarity, so that maybe Dutch citizens will feel that there's a good point to give money to Poland, and that they don't see Polish citizens only through their national lens, but simply as someone who might, you know, face the same consequences of the climate change as they do. And European taxes, another big issue. We'll see if that ever comes. There are a few, you know, the plastic tax, the financial transaction tax, but I think it might be easier to develop interpersonal solidarity if we have European taxes rather than only national taxes that are then put together. But it's a very sensitive political topic once again. So I'm coming to the end because I know we want to have a discussion as well. What I tried to do during this 1 year is to develop options on how to develop EU solidarity in the future, which is very difficult because, one, I hope you understood that solidarity is very, you know, inconcrete yet. It's not really a policy field like the economic governance in the EU or climate change policy. So it's quite hard to kind of bring down. And then it's also very hard to kind of develop options from there, because it's closely linked to European integration and how you see European integration in the future. One of the things, I mean, it's pretty obvious, I think reducing EU solidarity, in my view, is not really an option because it can have spillover effects. I think Brexit was a very strong case for it as well. It can also reduce national solidarity, which is not good. Then we can maintain the status quo, which I think in Brussels lots of people, well, at least decision makers tend to favor. And then there's either developing interstate solidarity, so more government-centered, or interpersonal and citizen-centered solidarity. I think both can also work together. That's maybe an important point to make. Yeah. And then I looked at the criteria, but that's very think tanky, so you don't have to look at that. It's more like kind of what kind of criteria do you need to think of when you develop those options. Now I'm coming to the main conclusions and then a few recommendations, because I'm still a think tanker, and so you need to have some nice recommendations at the end, even though you're not decision makers I'm talking to, but I think they're quite important still to remember. I think I made clear that it's very little research, so I would hope that, more people would look at solidarity. It's also something that comes up in crisis moments. I mean, even my research fellowship was, clearly linked to the COVID-19 crisis, and now no one really, like at the end of the fellowship, no one really cared about solidarity anymore, unfortunately. But it seemed like it's coming back always, because the more crisis you have and the more, common EU solutions you need to find, the more solidarity becomes important. The second thing is that EU solidarity, and I also mentioned it, is mostly transactional. So it's very based on this kind of trade-offs between member states saying, I will give you money if you give me this. It's not really based on a sense of, common belonging, maybe a little bit. But I feel that especially in the Council, it's still very much more of a trade-off. And also probably because there are no clear ties between EU citizens yet. Third one is that there is leeway in the EU treaties to develop solidarity, so that's the good news. And the last one is that, as I mentioned, I think we need to kind of, see the EU as a legitimate thing if solidarity is to be there. And I think that's quite important, because if we don't see the EU as a legitimate body to develop solidarity, then it's not going to work out. So it's also a question of the legitimacy of the political system if we have solidarity between EU citizens. And now into the recommendations, and that's the last slide. I think the EU institutions, and with that I also mean, of course, national governments, should really rethink their concept of solidarity. What does it actually mean? Because for now, they don't really have a strategy. They talk about it a lot. It's a call for action. You see it a lot in speeches. But in the end, when it comes to policy, there is not much there, unfortunately. The second point, which is very dear to my heart, and it also goes into, the programs like the European Solidarity Corps, is that you need to establish the conditions for solidarity to emerge. And with that, I mean programs like Erasmus, programs like the European Solidarity Corps. You need to invest in citizens actually having these exchanges cross-border to be able to realize that there is solidarity that goes beyond the nation state. And that's something that is very little developed and often seen, and I'm saying this from Brussels' perspective, as something extra or nice to have, but not necessarily as a precondition for European integration. The third one, and that's also an important one, is that we need to think solidarity closer to the cohesion agenda, because that's quite strong in the EU. You have cohesion funds that exist for many, many years now. And if we integrate more solidarity in those cohesion funds, it might be a good idea, start with something already existing. And one last point is that I don't think that EU solidarity is in contradiction with national solidarity. It reinforces it because national solidarity is there. It's something good, and it's not because we have national solidarity that, you can't have EU solidarity or the other way around. I think you can have both, and I think the pandemic showed that quite nicely. We did have a lot of solidarity at national level, and we also managed to have a little bit of solidarity at EU level, and they were complementary. Yes, and that's it. So I will finish with my wonderful paper that I wrote last year. Hopefully there will be a second one, but I tried to kind of really bring together what I said here in this paper, looking at solidarity from all these different aspects, especially, of course, from an EU policy aspect. But looking at the future, I really hope that you will also go to Brussels and say to decision makers how important the work you do is, because sometimes I feel that they might not necessarily realize there are great programs out there, but they need to have more political weight to be carried on. And that's it.
Thank you very much, Sophie, for your very thought-provoking thoughts. Now it's time for a joint questions and answers with both Tommi and Sophie. So can we get Tommi to the screens as well? And now it's time for everyone here and everyone online to start thinking about good questions. Elizabeth here will be going around with the microphone, and we see a lot of hands raising already, which is wonderful, exactly what we wanted. So I think we should start. So please, when you ask the question, please address either one of the speakers or both of them, so you can choose, and I guess we'll have a nice debate with the both of you. Excellent. So please raise your hands. Yes.
And you wanted to talk the last days too, so.
I can also ask questions instead of making statements as well. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for both presentations. I didn't see the first one fully, but I came at the best part, that what do we need, etc. But as representing Youth Forum, I know the work that you do is like kind of throwing eggs on the walls. The results are not quite good looking, but with the input that has been presented before and the data that we have in civil society, what do you think is necessary, or at least how can we share to the people to understand what is necessary to reach the European dimension of solidarity? I think the issue of the work we do as civil society is quite evident, research-wise, data-wise, number-wise, But unfortunately, we always have in each MFF, in each round of negotiations, in each round of new projects, we always need to reproduce and re-justify the work we do as civil society. However, our power as civil society is shrinking continuously. That would be like a little bit of your reflection, if possible. Thank you.
Yes. I mean, I'm happy to just react to that because I'm also part of the civil society as a think tanker, I would say. One of the things is that, of course, we live in a time where everyone needs to, explain all the time why the work they do is important. But it has some effects. I mean, I don't want to be too pessimistic because if you look at, for instance, the Erasmus funds, which really got increased massively in the last MFF, that's good news. I'm not saying it's perfect, but at least it's something that is there. And one of the points I always tend to make is that you need to be very target-oriented. The EU policy is not only made in Brussels, it's very much made in the national capitals. So go to your ministries, and even if they say, oh, it's not my responsibility, they decide these things in Brussels, they are deciding it in the national ministry. So go to your national ministries and explain to them why you think it's important that, EU funding exists, and why you think it needs to be, the work you do is so important. I think there's very little people in the end that realize that the competences lie, unfortunately, still at member state level, and that they tend to be the ones that say, oh, the money's not that important, it's like this kind of nice to have, but we need to have all these other budget lines that we need to be taken care of. So in the end, it's always the culture and the education that, falls aside, even though these are so important for the cohesion of our societies. So, yeah, as a response.
Tommi, do you want to comment as well?
I mean, I would say that the sense of the conditions for solidarity that Sophie talked about are built on a local level. If we don't make sure that cities, for instance, or municipalities understand the importance of civil society, I think it's very difficult to make that case on a national level. I think there's, as I said, I think there's more potential for solidarity on the local level, because local identities are fluid, and I think there's also ways to build kind of a stronger connection between the European level and the local level, and sometimes even bypassing the national level that usually is fairly exclusive. I am worried about this development that I see in a lot of cities, where actually cities don't support civil society as a value itself and don't understand that a functioning local democracy needs a functioning free civil society, and more local governments are seeing the civil society as a contractual partner for program delivery, which basically leads to a development where the priorities of civil society are not decided by civil society, but by the funders who contract the civil society organizations rather than supporting them through grants. I think it's very difficult to build European solidarity if more people in our societies don't feel like they're being respected as individuals, and I think that's kind of the most worrying development that I've seen. This idea that I was talking about as being seen as an anybody and nobody versus a somebody, and I think it leads to very defensive reactions from people, which we've seen in quite a few elections and other political decisions over the last years.
We have very different perspectives, Tommi, and I think it's interesting. I think you're coming more from a sociological perspective. I'm obviously more of the political scientist here. Being French and German, you can see that I would like the local and the city level to have more power, because I can see that this is exactly where solidarity exists, and I would fully agree with you. The problem is that you see the difference depending on the political system as well. I mean, in Germany, you do have a federal system where, regional levels have more competences and have more power to actually create that kind of solidarity. In France, it's non-existent. Like there is a centralized state, the nation state, you cannot bypass it. And in the EU political system, it's the same. Nation states have such an important power that it's almost impossible to do policy without them. So whereas I think it would be nice to have more power to the local and city level, I don't see these political systems changing so rapidly that, you know, the power structure changes in a way. And I know it sounds a bit like Gramsci and, you know, power structures, but this is how politics work, unfortunately. So I wish I had more of a roadmap to see how we can achieve this, because I do see that cities become more important, that, you know, there is more research about cities and what role they can play, that big cities like London, Paris, Berlin take a more important role with their mayors, but they are not represented in the political system that we have. And I saw that you were a researcher at Demos Helsinki, and I think that's why we also need democratic reforms in that sense, or democratic innovations, to make sure that these different levels are better represented.
Just to clarify, I'm also a political scientist, not a sociologist.
Sorry.
And I do think that if we talk about conditions also for a functioning national system that creates conditions for a European system, I think creating those conditions rely on people's experience on a local level. I'm actually not talking that much about moving powers to the local level. I think the local level is the one that creates conditions for people to actually believe that working with other cultures and places is worth it, and that in a way can create conditions for people to get out of this scarcity mindset where you think that if someone else gains something that we probably will lose. And I think that's kind of what we are experiencing in cities on a national level and on a European level, that we constantly feeling like our life is too hard. And when we think that our life is too hard and we don't have positive experiences with people from other fields of life, we end up thinking that someone else has it easier than us. But if we don't have a real connection to people from different places, it's easier to actually foster that thinking that someone else is getting an easier deal than we do.
I think there's quite some more questions so far.
Great. We can.
I want to follow up on that, and I was coming from a computer science background. Increasingly, a lot of people are working with computers, like you tend to work with a computer screen. Before the COVID, it was mostly in an office environment. At least you had some interpersonal relations with people. Now with COVID, we see increasingly there's an increasing workforce that works remotely, and sometimes alone and maybe in their own space, and has interpersonal relations through means like Skype or Teams and stuff like that. Do you think that affects their sense of anybody, that they're feeling like an anybody, nobody, or somebody, like, and their interpersonal sense that, hey, I'm doing something here, I'm just sitting alone in this room and I'm not having an impact? Because personally, I feel like when I go and teach computer science to people and I see the impact I have, and then when I'm working alone in front of a computer the whole day, I kind of get like very different feeling from what you're referring to. I don't know if it plays a role.
If I'll try to answer that, I think it's clear that in a way the digital tools have opened new worlds and new modes of collaboration to us. For instance, in my work, we're able to do much more work with cities around the world now, much quicker. But at the same time, on a personal level, I think it's the current digital tools that we have are fairly good for transactional exchange of ideas or doing projects together. But there's a lot of these like small things, like we don't have eye contact when we talk through these means. Which is a new thing, that we are seeing ourselves when we talk to other people, which creates a very bizarre experience, which we're not used to when we're not talking through a screen. So like now I'm talking to you and I'm watching myself, which is kind of weird. I think we can all relate to that, and I don't think we are fully aware of how these things influence the way we interact with other people. But I'm hopeful that we've just seen the early stages of kind of the interaction facilitation that technology can do, and I think we can have better tools. But I think we've made significant progress over the last couple of years. But I think it's good to recognize that for instance, eye contact is really important for building trust.
Yeah, I fully agree with it. I think one of the big issues also that I mean, especially during the pandemic, you realized that you had to find a new way of dealing with people in front of a camera. And I think it got much better. I mean, in my experience, at least, there were rounds where you could really feel that there was an exchange. You know, you had a lot of like Zoom breakout sessions with like kind of speed dating formats where you have to kind of ask questions that are creating links and connection with people. But it's a completely new culture that we need to build up online and in a way. And I think maybe one more point that is looking more at the meta level or like the more abstract level is that these digital spaces often are, you know, one, privatized. I mean, you can just hear it with Elon Musk buying Twitter, for instance, which not necessarily good because they decide upon the framework in which we move in those digital spaces. And so the kind of algorithms and the framework for this needs to be regulated. And I think that's the big point the EU is trying to do with the DSA and DMA, at least, to make sure that the framework that we move ourselves in the digital sphere is human-centered and not maybe user-centered, because that means that, you know, it's a transaction and it's all about business and creating clicks, but rather to have an open debate and to have that basis, I think, is really important. It's a difficult subject, though, because obviously, you know, there is a state capitalism like the Chinese model, the US model, and Europe is not doing really well in creating its own model when it comes to that. So we'll see how that goes.
Hello, thank you to both of you for your presentations. My name is Nadine. I'm also a political scientist.
A lot of them.
And I have a question that is mainly directed to you, Sophie. So, as I understood, your paper was mainly about the question, how solidarious is the European Union really? And I believe that we do politics, we do economy to actually make the human experience better so that we're having better lives, right? So for me, that kind of solidarity matters, that actually reaches the civil society and that in the end reaches the individual. So as far as I understood, the EU has largely programs that tackle interterritorial solidarity, like moving resources from one country, from one region to the other. Such as the cap that you mentioned. I would just like to give that example because I've had a look at the cap when it was signed in 2020, which was for me, I have to say, because I work in pollinator protection, a quite frustrating experience. That there's one, like I would say, number that I think it's very interesting to let it settle, which is that 80% of the cap funds, cap is by the way the Common Agricultural Policy, 80% of the cap funds go to 20% of the biggest players in the agricultural industry. So only to 20% of the biggest players already. So I'm not sure if that is an example of solidarity actually reaching the individual, because no small farmer, nobody that would like to start out growing their own goods actually benefits from that. Rather takes harm from it. So my question then would be, so that I actually reach a question as well, is apart from the ESC and the Erasmus Plus, which for me are really examples where solidarity reaches the individual, how can the EU policy really reach the civil society in the bigger funds, you know? And I think it's quite easy to find solidarity related or solidarity-like policy in the EU, such as looking at moving money from one region to from one country to the other. But is that real solidarity? So it's also a question of definition, and to also round it up, what is it then? Is it more hype or is it more substance, referring to your title? Thank you.
Very good question, and also a very good point. I think the first thing you said is extremely important, that solidarity should be there to reach the people, and that, you know, the EU, what the EU is doing is supposed to reach the people, which I totally agree, and I will be quite critical with the EU that it's not always the case. I think what I try to do is first have a look at what kind of solidarity mechanisms exist, which should be solidarity mechanisms, how the implementation then goes, or how, you know, it is decided upon, and whether these funds also reach the majority of people is another question. And that's a political question, I think, which is closely linked to what kind of political system we have, and whether decision makers in those sitting in those rooms actually, you know, take the decisions for the majority or not. And there, it's the council that takes the decisions on the MFF, which in the end takes the decisions on how many cohesion funds you have, how much common agricultural policy you have, and where this money goes. Then the Commission's, of course, involved as well when it comes to the implementation then. But it's an institutional question, I would say. And unfortunately, you know, French agriculture, big agricultural associations are extremely good at lobbying in Brussels, and they will have an impact. So I think there's an imbalance between how much civil society is represented and what kind of impact it has in Brussels. And, for instance, corporate interests are represented. I mean, everyone knows it, but it's still problematic in that sense, because then you do have a cap that mostly funds, you know, energy-intensive industries and farming that are not necessarily good for the climate targets. So that's maybe a point I've been noticing as well, working on EU policy for the last 3 years and more than that from Berlin before. It's not always the right prioritization, unfortunately, and you do have a lot of incoherences in between programs. You have a lot of policies that might be, you know, looking at only one thing, and then they have negative effects on the other. And it's true that it's also extremely complex at EU level, because you have a range of policies, and sometimes they don't work with each other. And there you have policies that might have a very positive objective and in the end have negative effects on something else because they just didn't think about it. Sometimes it's intentional, but I think a lot of it is also very unintentional, unfortunately. And that's why you need to have better cross-sectoral work together as well, and to realize what kind of effects policies can have. And that's a super difficult topic. And I mean, that's also why think tanks are working on it. But sometimes it's really hard to know exactly the kind of impact you have. And that's why you have impact assessments. But even there, sometimes you don't even know what kind of impact it will have. I'm not saying that the cap is like this. I think it was quite intentional, unfortunately. Yeah, there it is quite intentional. But yeah, I think there's a lot of progress to be made. Just to recap.
Tommi, do you want to comment? No.
I really like the kind of the world of EU policy as a political scientist, but I think Sophie gave an excellent answer on this. So, yeah.
To answer your question, I think for now it is more hype, to be very fair. I think it is more of a symbolism used in speeches, but if you look at the policies, which I tried to do last year, yeah, there's not much substance, unfortunately. I think the more substance is probably one of your programs, Erasmus Plus, that really has this kind of solidarity aspect to it. But other than that, not too much, unfortunately. Which means there's still a lot of progress to be made as well.
Next question.
I thank both speakers because the presentations they were really great. I am Julio, a teacher from Spanish University in European Union integration. So Sophie, really your presentation was amazing. I was missing a little bit like in the 60s when we return back to the history, the example of, the confrontation between Holstein Commission and de Gaulle, because Holstein was trying to push more in solidarity, and de Gaulle was saying, no, I do the empty chair crisis and let's talk about another thing. And in the 80s, we have another example how the British, they didn't want to keep the solidarity going and they asked their money back. So give me my check. But when we have this European Union citizenship born in the 90s, since then we have been making developments, and I think you have touched that if we want to develop more solidarity between member states, the citizenship has to be more explored. But in the different historical events, and you pointed like very, very shortly, the European Union economic crisis, the European Union migration crisis, solidarity there was an existence. I mean, there were countries saying that southern states, they were using the money to pay wine and ladies instead of, public policies. That was coming from the economic minister of finance in Netherlands. So what are we talking when we say about the solidarity? It is solidarity next generation. That is a good example. I think that is the movement we have to go. But with only 3 legal bases in the treaties, Article 2.3 from Treaty of the European Union, 80 from the Functioning Treaty, and 222 from the Functioning Treaty is not enough, because, gives a lot of space to the member states to say what solidarity is actually. Because there are member states that, for example, they say one day, yes, open the arms with Aquarius boat in Valencia port. Others, they say, welcome refugees, but we don't welcome any refugees. And others, they put a wall, because we have become the Europe of fortress in the last years, demonstrating that, yes, we citizens, we want to help, but actually are the states who, members in this conference, 2 days ago, they were almost deported in the airport because they were not showing like 2 vaccinations from a certain company in Europe. So really, I don't believe that solidarity is going to come only because citizens, they say. It's because the member states, the leaders, they go ahead and they take that lead. And look, the last example, Brexit. Brexit in certain fields shows us that cohesion funds, they will not always bring us more pro-European solidarity, because Cornwall, for instance, one of the southern regions of Britain that most funds receive, they voted in favor of Brexit. So it's not going to bring cohesion policy of funding more like a sense of belonging. It is coming with, more sharing, more education policies, more healthcare policies in the EU level, not only in the member states, because that will mean that Romania or Spanish or Germans, they can feel that if they have a disease, they will be treated in German hospitals or in the Spanish hospitals, and that they will not cost, and that we are going to have pensions in the future related to European level. That means, solidarity, because otherwise, some policies in the national levels, is the only one that has still that tools to save their citizens. In case of crisis, I'm going to help you. But the EU level, only 1% of GDP is not enough. So that was my question. How can we develop solidarity in the next treaty reform? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just have 2 comments to make. How to develop solidarity in the next treaty reform? I mean, we're not sure to have treaty changes. We'll see. I think that's a far-off question. I think we should use what we have. I mean, I really agree with what Tommi said in his presentation about, taking it from reality. And I think I'm quite a pragmatist in that sense, that we do have EU treaties and we're not fully using them at the moment. You do have passerelle clause, you do have, decision-making mechanisms that we don't necessarily use to the full potential, because there's also not the political will to do so. And I think there it's a question of, and I will focus on national governments because they have so much power in the EU, you can change national government's perspective, and national elections do count a lot when it comes to EU policy. So I think there's really like this leverage. I'd like to make 2 points. The first point is about, whether, solidarity is a question of perspective, and it's a word that is used in many different ways. Also depending on the national lens you look at it. I mean, in the Euro crisis, and I mentioned all these crises because there were moments where, for some of us, there were moments of solidarity, but not for others. And then people say it wasn't solidarity. If you look at German newspapers during the Euro crisis, Germans felt like they were giving a lot of solidarity to Greece because they were bailing them out. That was the impression. I'm not saying it was right. I'm saying this is the impression there was there within German public opinion. Wasn't the case in Greece. They didn't feel like they had any kind of solidarity. And I think the kind of different perceptions we have in solidarity are really problematic, and that's why we need to talk about them. Because it's, really, if you go to Germany, lots of them will say, yeah, we did really our best, but then Greeks will say, but all the money went to banks. But yeah, I mean, it's an important question. And the second thing on the cohesion funds, that's also a really important point you make. Yes, a lot of regions in the UK did receive cohesion funds, and it didn't help them feel more European, because money alone won't make you, change your identity. That's why I think it's important to focus on things like Erasmus, on civic cohesion as well, which is something I'm going to work on. I'm really looking forward to this. And that's why I think cohesion policy is more of a vehicle or like a policy instrument that exists at EU level that can be used because it already is there, but it shouldn't only go to, you know, creating infrastructure, even though I think it's quite important to have good train infrastructure, for instance, but also to spend more money on education and civil society. There again, national governments are really reluctant to give more competence to the EU when it comes to that. Education is extremely national still, and they don't want it. So I think there is a lot of, you know, public or pressure to be made for national governments to change their positions.
Tommi, do you want to comment?
Yes, I guess the most worrying development that I see, which doesn't create very good conditions for EU solidarity, is the development that was kind of heightened or made faster by COVID, which is this division of the labor market that you see in most places, which leads to disappearance of the middle class, which basically for people like at least myself, kind of knowledge workers, life is getting so much easier, kind of convenient. We can do our laundry in the middle of the day. We have less control in our lives. We can decide when we go to the office or not. And then a large part of the labor market is pushed into this completely new level of servitude, where basically you're controlled to such extremes, and we know so much about your life, and we can know when the delivery guy takes a 5-minute break. And then I think this development where certain people who've at least traditionally also benefited more from different like European mobility opportunities have greater and greater opportunities to build the life that they have reason to value, whereas we're pushing more and more people in most European places into this role of servitude, as in serving the trivial or real needs of the elite, which I belong to. I think it's very difficult to build EU solidarity based on this. Because there's so many people in our societies who feel like they're not respected. They've actually been told to kind of go away because they're slow and old and they have embarrassing opinions. And I think EU should really find ways to broaden the European experience to those people who might be the most reluctant to take part in those programs. Now the benefits go to the ones who are already quite European, and then you create this vicious cycle of condescending approaches where we from the elites go to people to tell how they live in false consciousness and how if they would be like us, they would be better people, whereas they don't have the same conditions to build a life they have reason to value as the elites. I saw this very clearly during COVID when I was at that time still working for the city of Helsinki, managing a department of 1,800 people. The whole discussion on media was like how the knowledge workers are able to build these flexible lives at home and spend more time with their kids, whereas from the 1,800 people that I worked with, only 300 were able to work from home, and 1,500 went to customer service every single day, fearing for catching the virus. And I think more work needs to be done in how the elite kind of takes ownership of the mess that they've created and how they pushed so many people to this new level of servitude. Sorry, that got slightly political, but I think that's why focusing on the human experience is important. I don't think this can be solved on a structural level alone, and I think we've seen in so many countries lately how primal reactions we as people do when we feel like we're not respected.
If I can just add to that, because I think it's a really important point. I would say that there is a structural issue to this, because if we see more inequality, it's a political decision that was taken. I mean, it's not as if, it came out of nowhere. It's the lack of regulation of labor markets that made that you do not have that kind of middle class. So there's also political response to this. That's the good news, you know. It doesn't have to stay that way. And it's a question of what kind of decision makers we elect in the end that will change the decision. So I really believe in the power of politics in that sense, that you can change also things for the better if, you know, we realize there's a problem. I mean, the extent of the inequalities we could see in the pandemic, I think, are really problematic, and I fully agree that, you know, the lack of respect makes it very hard for people to also feel European or feel like we are even talking to them. And I think there's like lots of work to be done to make sure that we reach a point where people feel like we also reach those maybe that don't see why they should even participate in a European program. I mean, and that's not only the work of the EU institutions, but also I think every kind of political level that you have. And I think their cities hopefully can play also a big role in how they, you know, urban infrastructure to make sure that you have public services, things you work on, Tommi. So, yeah, lots of areas to kind of have to work with to change that.
Okay. Any other questions, additional questions?
Everyone's a coffee break.
Yeah, you already had a question, so just to give the floor to maybe if there is. So.
Everyone wants a coffee break, no?
Quick one.
Quick one. The reluctant question.
Thank you. It was actually also a comment from the colleague here next to me that it's just a quick comment on what Tommi said. I don't have that experience of those working at home in the knowledge as a knowledge worker, that they're necessarily climbing up the social ladder, like landing on the like on the good side of social division and being more privileged because they work at home. There are also people working 12, 14 hours a day now because they're at home, and especially women taking care of children. There's that one quote I've once heard is, if you think that you can do child raising and working from home at the same time, you understand neither working from home nor child raising. So yeah, that was just a quick comment, and I'm just really wondering, maybe that's a question for the coffee break. So who believes or who feels that politicians are actually solidarious with the citizens? Because we're talking about the responsibility of citizens and the ESC and the Erasmus Plus to create more solidarity, but I feel a little bit like the responsibility from the politicians' side must definitely, they must step up. So that's my question.
If I may
Go
comment
ahead,
on
Tommi.
that, I mean, I really value that you brought that up. And my point about knowledge workers like referred mostly to the kind of the European elite like myself, whose experience is driving the discussion about the future of work at the moment. I think a lot of remote workers are actually in the very similar space than those who do a physical day-to-day, face-to-face customer service, because their transactions and the behavior can be monitored to a level that was never before possible. On your comment on politicians, I think we've seen this development in Europe for a long time, where the roles of civil servants and the roles of elected leaders are kind of getting blurred, and a lot of politicians want to take the role of an expert in decision making, rather than the role of kind of, which is the classical role of politicians, as in giving value to the data that's given to you, and that leads to this thing that the distance between the people you're supposed to represent and your personal experience grows greater. So if we're not electing people who are representatives of who we are, rather than electing the best experts into political leadership, I think we end up into a very blurry place, and it's understandable why people can't see people like themselves in decision making, and that also alienates people from politics. So thank you for commenting on that issue about remote work. That was really important.
And I know you all want to go to to a coffee break, but one last comment on the politics, and then I'll shut up as well. Yes, I agree. I think we need to have politicians that are responsible, and sometimes, you know, for instance, I feel that there's not enough. I mean, I'm a think tanker, so I will say there's not enough studies, but there's not enough looking at, you know, what were actually the results of your mandate. We don't really look at, you know, what they actually achieve or not. And I'm not saying that politicians have an easy job. I think for a lot of them it's really hard, especially if you're female politicians, you know, all the hate you get. So it's also, I mean, I respect people who want to get into politics because I know how difficult it is. At the same time, I feel that a lot of them, or the system makes it very hard for them to also take the best decisions for citizens. Because you do have, you know, the media, you do have party lines, you do, I mean, political parties telling you what to do. Then you do have, you know, lots of different vested interests coming to you, wanting stuff from you. So it's a very difficult environment to navigate in, to make sure that you take the right decisions in the end. And I think that's a systemic issue that we face within democracies, and that's why I work on it so much, because I think we need to reform it to make sure that it's more citizen-centered. But I think that we should definitely have politicians that are more responsible, and that we also make sure that, you know, that they have accountability and transparency. So I think these 2 points are linked, and that's it.
Thank you very much, Tommi and Sophie. Just to finish off, because yesterday we were talking about hope as well, like there's nothing without hope. So just to end with a high note, when it comes to our topic today, what gives you hope? Tommi, do you want to go first?
Some things that give me hope are, for instance, the things I see happening in cities in Latin America, where they are really pushing for radical changes in how public services are created with people. When you have to kind of renew things, you can't just fine tune. And I think Europe could learn a lot from the transformations that you see in Latin America. I think the other thing that gives me hope is that there are cases, especially on a city level, where politicians are bold enough to use the powers they're given, and they can actually win elections by pushing for more equality. So I think we should maybe focus slightly more on analyzing the successful cases. I think that would also spread hope more. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. A round of applause for Tommi. Thank you, Tommi.
Yes, sorry. What gives me hope is clearly, and it sounds very cheesy, but that sometimes you do have exchanges that really bring things forward. And I mean, the Solidarity Corps is a great example of, you know, a project that was made to make sure that, you know, you have more solidarity amongst European citizens. And also maybe that doesn't need to be necessarily completely idealistic either. I think it's very much compatible with the pragmatism of politics, where you can create win-win situations where you have national interests that align with the European interests, and then you move forward. And you see that a lot in the EU as well, even if I criticize a lot of the European Union policies, but sometimes it does work, and that's why it's important to also look at the windows of opportunities when this can happen, where, you know, maybe politicians that is terrible in other aspects actually made a good decision and says, oh yes, I can really profit from spending more money on education, for instance. And this can happen, and we should value it for what it is.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and a round of applause for Sophie as well. Thank you so much. This was the last session of the Europe Talk Solidarity Conference for our online viewers. So I would like to thank everyone for watching, and please stay tuned for anything to follow up, because I'm sure that a lot of things related to solidarity will happen again, both online and live. But thank you for our online viewers.